It took me a long time to be comfortable in myself and my own body and my own head. Probably too long, but nobody's perfect. I had really, really bad traumatic experiences with needles and injections when I was a kid. So obviously I've got a birthmark on my face. When I was young, I had quite exploratory laser treatment back in the 80s when it wasn't commonplace at all, and I was one of the first children in the UK to have laser treatment, and along with that came a huge injection in my face. Ever since then I had a huge phobia of needles, and it took me 20-30 years to get over that. So actually a lot about being able to sit in the tattoo chair has been about another sort of acceptance of that traumatic period and moving that to one side. I sort of made a decision when I was about 40 to get one, and then it took me about 4 years to actually decide the right sort of style for me. I've got a lot of creativity in my head, but I'm useless at art. I can't draw to save my life. So finding somebody who could interpret the thoughts and the madness that I had and all the ideas and wants that I had in my head. What I wanted was something really abstract, something that's really personal to me. The conversation I had with Ash right at the start was I wanted something really organic, really intense, full of energy. Essentially it starts off on my chest with the two rings. They represent my sons, and the centerpiece of it is the explosive element and all that energy coming out of the center, almost like a rebirth. And we talked through the elements of it with Ash, and the words Big Bang and that solar explosion came out, and then it gradually dissipates down across the torso and out across the shoulder. And what I loved about what he does is for me it's really fresh, it's really innovative. He's way out there in terms of testing the boundaries and that distressed element of everything that he does and the way that he makes things flow around people's bodies. There's lots of references back to my mental health, to my long-term battle with depression and anxiety. Ultimately, the thing that sort of helped me to get around my mental health was just acceptance, just being who I am, because I've never been very body confident, and so this was for me just an expression for myself. I do want it as a marker and a stage in my life where I'm accepting what I've got and the package that I've come in, and just making the most of it and making it look cool for me. Here I am, 10 months later, I've got a third of my body tattooed, going from zero to a lot in a short space of time, which was always part of my goal and my aim. Yeah, I am really proud actually. It's quite difficult for me to say that because I'm not a very self-confident person. I've got two fantastic kids, I live by the sea, and nothing ever stands still for very long, and really wanting to try and enjoy the rest of my life rather than it being hard and painful and stressful and all the rest of it. I want it to be happy and enjoy what I've got. So